and welcome to this post-budget talk. This was a budget which was well signposted as early as October 2021. The Minister for Finance was the keynote speaker at the 35th Singapore Economic Roundtable on the 15th of October last year. And he talked about the three curves on which MOF is focused. First, the curve of inequality. And he said that the government's policy response is not just limited to redistribution, but the goal is also to promote social mobility. And this, in my view, is essential for Singapore's sustained success. The second curve the minister talked about is the demographic. And we're all now very well aware that by 2030, 25% of Singaporeans will be over the age of 65. And the minister said back in October that while the upcoming GST increase will help fund Singapore's increased spending on healthcare, it will not be enough. So the policy aim is productive longevity. That is, all of us working longer. The minister recognized this will require considerable societal and workforce mindset shifts. The third and final curve the minister focused on is emissions. And he announced back in October that carbon tax would be increased with effect from financial year 2024. And of course, the details were announced last Friday. The minister's overarching message was more funding is needed to achieve positive outcomes for all three curves. And that message flowed directly into this year's budget. And I think we can all agree that last Friday we listened to a very well considered and delivered budget statement. So what does it all mean for you and your businesses? Here to provide their analyses and insights are three expert practitioners. I'm delighted to welcome back Ms. Selena Ling, Chief Economist, Head of Treasury Research and Strategy for OCBC Bank, Dr. Chua, Regional Co-Head of Macro Research for Maybank Investment Bank Group, and joining us for the first time is Mr. James Choo, Partner, International Tax and Transaction Services for Ernst & Young Solutions, LLP. A warm welcome to each of you. Selena will talk to us about the post-pandemic recovery, comment on the even fairer and more progressive tax measures announced. She'll also talk about the cost of living issues we all battle with, and whether the announcements in Budget 2022 are really bold enough to encourage continued business transformation. Hakbin will cover BEPS, base erosion and profit shifting issues. He'll consider the foreign worker measures and also talk in broad terms on the theory and practice of wealth taxes and of course GST. Last but not least, James will detail the tax changes announced in the budget. He has much more to cover this budget than his predecessors in previous years. Each of our guest speakers has up to 20 minutes to present. They will speak in the order I have introduced them, starting with Selena, and each will hand over to the next speaker. Their comments will be followed by a Q&A session moderated by me, so we can all benefit from your questions and our expert practitioners' answers. So at any time during the webinar, please feel free to type your questions into the Q&A function, which you will find in the toolbar at the bottom of your screens. You can upvote those questions which most appeal to you, and I would ask you keep your questions short to help me as moderator and to help ensure our traditionally lively conversation. Ladies and gentlemen, it is now my pleasure to invite Selena to address us. Selena, over to you.
Thank you, Victor. Let me just pull up my screen. So my thanks to Sicc and Victor for inviting me to share today. It's my pleasure to share with you some of my post-budget thoughts. And let me kick off by showing you the picture of the day. If you look at mobility trends for Singapore, the big question is, are we back to pre-COVID days? You can actually see that the green line, which is the number of people still largely working from home, has come off from the highs, but generally still above where we started. And as for the visitor, numbers to whether using public transits, going out to retail, recreation areas, and even going back to the workplace, you can see that actually they haven't fully recovered to COVID. So this kind of sets the backdrop of where we stand. Effectively, this is going to be the third year of the pandemic. Vaccination rates are very high, but we have all gone for our booster shots and we're still worrying about next virus variants. So I found this table here quite interesting to note because it shows quite a nice snapshot. 2022 is going to be a story of two halves. You can see that in the first half of this year, we are going to see a slowdown from the second half of last year for most of the major economies, with the key exception of Asia and ASEAN. And this is largely because the Delta variant last year in third quarter took a much, much bigger chunk out of our growth compared to the major economies. But you will see a slowdown in the G3 economies into the second half of the year, but you'll also see that Asia and ASEAN is not immune to that slowdown. And the opposite is actually true for inflation, because inflation is likely to peak in the first half of this year, probably around the middle of this year, before it actually moderates next year. So what are the current headwinds facing us? There's a lot of talk of inflation, obviously, and that's driving a lot of central banks to withdraw their policy support. Just a month or two back, the Fed was talking about 2 rate hikes, but now the market's pricing in more than 6 rate hikes. We are also seeing a lot of volatility, risk on, risk off, Ukraine now dominating headlines. And of course, global supply chain bottlenecks haven't really gone away. But the chart on the right shows that actually the major economies are having a much more difficult time compared to Asia when it comes to supplier delivery and backlogs of work. So what does this all mean for Singapore? Last year's growth actually was blockbuster, 7.6% year on year. That came, of course, on a low base in 2020 itself. But nevertheless, if you look at fourth quarter growth, we did hit a high note around 6.1% year on year. So despite inflation being very much on the radar of both businesses and individuals, actually our export has seemed to be fairly immune to the supply chain bottlenecks. In fact, you can almost say that Singapore is a beneficiary of some of these bottleneck problems, right? And on the policy front, it's very clear, monetary policy tightening is pushing ahead. We thought that fiscal policy would have returned to neutral or slightly more balanced budget, but it appears it's not to be, because we are still looking at another year of deficit. And if you look in terms of the leading indicators, actually first quarter growth is in a bit of a slowdown mode. A lot of the business expectations now are pointing to slightly softer momentum. And on the retail side, F&B, for instance, although we have seen, a fairly robust bounce back in 2021 itself, but barring a full reopening of the economy and all the border restrictions being lifted, we are unlikely to see a repeat double-digit growth. So let me start with monetary policy, because we have had 2 tightenings so far, and in fact, one was unscheduled in January this year. And I think expectations are, because of the overshoot that we're seeing both on the headline and the core inflation, it is very likely that MAS continues to tighten. So probably it's good news for people who import goods and services, maybe not so good news for those who are actually exporting to key markets where they may face a bit of the Sing dollar strength. So we are looking for core inflation to peak out around 2.7% this year, but it is critical to watch whether the first half actually will subside into the second half, as what I mentioned earlier. So let me quickly move now to the budget itself. This is actually taken word from the Ministry of Finance itself, but the bold highlights are mine. And I just want to draw your attention, Victor did allude to this earlier. There is a lot of focus on the social compact, what exactly makes a fairer and more sustainable and inclusive society, not really new per se. And there is also this third thrust, which is about positioning ourselves for the challenges and opportunities over the next 10 years. So it's really trying to take a long-term view. And the promises are this: government will provide targeted help, okay, particularly in helping Singaporeans cope with the cost of living. They will also try to make sure that we have access to world-class education, housing, and jobs, and also peace of mind over retirement. But on the economic front, there is a lot of changes we must make about investing in new capabilities, making the green transition, and also trying to develop a fairer and more resilient revenue structure. So in my following slides, I will try and point out some of my thoughts on whether they have achieved what they set out to do as highlighted here. So let me start first with the revenue and expenditure structure and the trends. Okay, I think we have to take note that in the last 3 years at least, the net investment return contribution, or the NIRC for short, is now the single largest contributor to the government's balance sheet, ahead of corporate income tax, personal income tax, and also GST. If you look at the spending side, almost half of our total expenditure goes to social spending. The bulk of that is in healthcare and education, quite understandably because we have an aging population and because we are focusing on lifelong learning in order to upskill the current workforce. This marks the 4th year of our deficit and the 3rd year of drawdown. So where do we go from here? So this is the table that they have showed in terms of their plans of 2022 and how much they're going to run in terms of the deficit. A 0.5% of GDP deficit actually is quite modest. In all likelihood, if they don't spend all that they set out to do, or if some of the revenue streams come in slightly more buoyant, they have a chance, I think, to still balance the budget. But my key 3 takeaways from budget 2022 are these. First, it does address some cost of living issues, but not necessarily all the cost of doing business. And I'll explain why later. Secondly, a lot of the tax restructuring push or measures that we see actually have both external and domestic drivers. There is a fair mix of both new and existing initiatives. Some of the questions I have that may not be fully answered by budget 2022, which is why I term them burning questions, is that I still don't have a sense on what is the ideal social compact. Finance Minister Lawrence Wong said that we are not, going the way of some of the welfare states that some European countries have. But where exactly are we looking at? That's not quite clear to me. And how does this affect our fiscal sustainability philosophy? In the past, we have always said, we don't want to kill the golden goose. We don't want to draw down on the principle of our past reserves. But this is the 3rd year we're doing so. Understandably, it's because of the pandemic crisis. But at what point do we say we are not going to do any more drawdowns? Or how are we going to make good on some of our accumulated drawdowns? And secondly, we are seeing the shifts, between corporate income tax, personal income tax, GST, and NIRC. Okay? NIRC is domestically determined, so that's up to the current leadership to decide. But if you look at corporate income tax, there are external forces beyond us, BEPS being one, and I think Hak Bin will talk a little bit more about that. And on the personal income tax, we are starting to see the very symbolic moves to actually increase what we call wealth taxes. But GST typically is seen as a regressive tax, but for now, we have large offset packages to mitigate that part of it. So the question really is, are the measures currently outlined in Budget 2022 bold enough to restore our long-standing fiscal prudence stance? I think we have to wait and see. So let me start with what it means for corporates like yourself, right? There is a very clear renewed push to transform, to internationalize, to go manpower lean, to merge, for instance, to go green, to go digital. So you can see that a lot of the programs here, there are some continued financing support to help with the cash flow front. But a lot of the support are ongoing incentives really to help SMEs to really try and transform themselves. And even larger local enterprises now, they are talking about SG Global Enterprises, SG Global Executive programs to basically help promising local enterprises internationalize and to attract local talent. So I think the key message from all these various schemes is that it's actually time to move on from COVID and to grow through transformation, digitalization, and internationalization. But there are some pain points, and one I think would be the manpower availability and also the cost of foreign manpower. We are seeing the expansion of the progressive wage model, right? The tightening of the minimum qualifying salaries for the EPs and the SPAS, and also the DRC reductions. There is some short-term relief from the progressive wage credit scheme, which is highlighted in the table below. But as you can see, these would run out effectively after 2026. So the burden of bearing the higher cost of foreign workers would come back to the companies. So unless you can extract the productivity benefits from paying higher salaries to the locals, if not, you have to hire a more expensive foreigner, then it will really be a squeeze in terms of your corporate margins. So there is some cash flow benefits, obviously, through the 500 million jobs and business support package. You do get 1,000 per local employee, right? Especially for SMEs, that's capped at 10,000. So that kind of like gives a little bit of relief in terms of cash flow for the short term. But I think the challenge really is that in the coming years, if you don't transform your manpower reliance and the structure of how you run your business, it will be very, very tough. And I think this is not the end of the tightening for the foreign manpower side. The other pain point really, I think, is in the push towards sustainability. Everyone says they want to be more sustainable and everyone says they want to be more green, right? But given the very ambitious carbon tax rate hike trajectory, we're talking about $50 to $80 per ton by 2030. And this is in line with, of course, what the IMF or the World Bank or what the Paris Agreement requires. But it is a very, very significant jump from the current $5 per ton that we are paying today. So for large emitters, they do have a choice. They can use international carbon offset credits to reduce, by 5%. But you can see that, in the chart on the right, where we are in terms of carbon pricing, we used to be slightly ahead of Korea. And if we really go to $50 to $80, we will be ahead even of the developed Western countries like Switzerland, for instance. So it is a very ambitious plan. Let me talk a little bit about wealth taxes, because this is seen to be part of a fair and inclusive tax system, right? Everyone wants a fair and inclusive tax system. But, as economists, we always say there's no free lunch. So the question is, who pays? It is very clear that in this budget, the people who are paying is the top income brackets. So you can see that those who are earning 500,000 and above, 1 million and above, they will see their top marginal tax rate go up from 22% to 23% and 24% respectively. What is quite interesting is that if you think back, a couple of years ago when they talked about the need to increase GST, it was really to fund the financing needs of an aging population. But effectively, with what the BEPS environment, the corporate income tax environment is changing, there is going to be a little bit of a shortfall on the corporate income side as well. So, the sense is that wealth taxes may have to increase further as well in the coming decade in order to make sure that the revenue streams remain healthy, right? So if you look at the chart on the right, you can see that even a top marginal tax rate of 24% for Singapore is still relatively low compared to the rest of the countries. So if you ask, why just move the top 2 personal income tax brackets? Well, it's a trade-off, right? Because you want to manage income inequality, you want to send the right signals that those who can afford more can pay more, but you also don't want to deter wealth or top talent from coming to Singapore, right? Actually, the number of taxpayers that is affected by this move is very, very little, but you can see that 2 brackets actually pay the bulk of the taxes when it comes to personal income. So it's quite understandable. You touch a very small fragment of the taxpayers, but you have the biggest bang for the buck. Now, what is the nexus between personal and corporate income tax, right? Singapore's headline corporate tax is 17%, but we all know that a lot of the big MNCs pay effective tax rates that are lower than even the proposed global 15% minimum corporate tax rate. So Singapore is exploring this top-up called the minimum effective tax rate to get an effective tax rate up to 15%. So people ask, will this actually blunt Singapore's competitiveness in attracting foreign direct investments? I think in the short term, it's still very much in play because we have to see what the other jurisdictions that are affected will also do. But our view is that Singapore's attractiveness for foreign direct investments really go beyond tax. It's the whole environment of, a clean government, efficient legal system, you have skilled manpower, you have attractive transport and other infrastructures. But I think going ahead, the challenge, of course, is that there are lots of up and coming places that are competing for the same dollar for foreign direct investments. So the question really is, Singapore has never been a cheap place to run a business here, but can we continue to add value? And this would really require the continued upskilling of the workers and keeping the economy dynamic and vibrant. So my sense is that, GST increasingly, or indirect taxes like GST, would become a bigger pillar of the tax structure. So you can see that each time that they actually hike the GST, they have always introduced the offset package. But this time around, even though they are moving in 2 percentage point increments again, actually the offset package is more than 50% bigger than the previous two offset packages, right? And in fact, certain of the schemes, like the GST voucher, is now being made permanent and being enhanced, right? So I think this is one way actually how they get around being the very regressive nature of the GST, because it is very tough for them to keep increasing personal income tax or even trying to maneuver around the changes in the corporate income tax side. So my last two slides, I just want to share with you is that tax changes aside, actually there are two big factors that are posing market headwinds right at this moment. This global supply chain disruption story really hasn't gone away. In fact, you can see up to December and January for some of the countries in the table below, the shortages really haven't eased that much, okay? And actually, if you look at it, obviously not all the countries or companies or industries are facing the global supply chain disruptions, but there are notable shortages in areas such as electronics, particularly semiconductor chips, right? So big companies have an advantage because they have the resources to charter their own private cargo ships, lease their own planes, etc. But for the smaller companies, they would really struggle because it means that transport and logistics cost has gone up, and they do have to probably warehouse more inventory in order to make sure that they don't run out of their supplies. Right? So going ahead, I think the challenge really, apart from tax and rising costs, is how do you manage your supply chain management, right? The other headwind, of course, is what we see, the news that's bombarding us every day about Russia and Ukraine. So $100 oil prices is not a matter of if, but when. And actually, if you look at our forecast, we think there's further upside. And this was really prior, these forecasts were done prior to the latest issues about Russia declaring certain Ukrainian states separatists, etc. Right? So I think the risk is really, if we are still if you have exposure to oil or oil-related items, there's no getting away from what is happening on the geopolitical front. So let me end by saying, actually, time for change is now. In the last 2 years or so, we were very mired in, when is the vaccine coming out? When is the next virus variant? How much is the policymakers helping me by extending assistance, etc. Those emergency lifelines days are over. Okay? I think the environment in a post-COVID, I hesitate to say post-COVID, maybe it's an endemic COVID environment, is that we are going to see a lot of market volatility. And the reason for that is because a lot of policymakers are now on a path of withdrawing the unprecedented help that they have given in the last 2 years. That is true not only on the central bank side, but probably also going to be very true for the fiscal side this year and in the years to come. That is not to say that despite all these challenges, there are no opportunities. I didn't have that much time to spend on the transition to the green environment, but I think this is one area, I think, that Singapore really can position to be one of the front runners for areas like carbon trading, and also in terms of the ESG models that we can actually export or advise to the region. So there are new growth areas, I think, for Singapore and for Singapore companies that are based here. The question, of course, is whether the small and medium-sized enterprises have the clear mindset shift to move away from crisis mode to growth and expansion mode. But like I've highlighted in the slides on the Budget 2022 Trust and a lot of the programs that are being put in place, the direction is very, very clear, right? You have to transform, you have to push ahead with growth, with digitalization, with internationalization, with mergers, and also exploring greener solutions from here. So with that, thank you very much, and let me hand you back to Victor.
Many thanks, Selena, and over to you, Hak Bin.
Thanks, Victor. Thanks, Selena. Let me just pull up the slides. Yep. I think Selena has provided a really good, broad, comprehensive talk on the budget and then outlook. So I'll probably skip some of the points and just maybe just add on. As Selena, growth is going to slow down this year, not surprisingly. So we are looking for growth to normalize back and still be slightly above potential, right? 3.8%, because sectors that were hit hard last year in some of the hospitality and aviation, they'll only start recovering this year, including construction. But inflation is really the kind of a big risk. And we saw that in the core inflation numbers yesterday, which rose to basically a decade high. And on the backdrop of tightening Fed policy, rising interest rates. So it's going to be pretty challenging. And I'm glad that the government has decided to delay the GST hike, because that will only just aggravate the inflation pressures, which doesn't seem to be, it doesn't look like it's going to abate anytime soon. The NIRC, are we really worried about the fiscal position and sustainability? For me, I think the government had time to delay it. So I think there's just to snap back at last year, for example, when you look at the first 9 months of the fiscal year, basically revenue exceeded expectations for quite a bit, and the government had to revise up the revenue. And on the other side, the spending side, the government actually underspent, right? So allowing the fiscal position to turn out to be much better. In fact, if you look at the corporate income tax that was accumulated for the first 9 months of that last fiscal year, was up 35%. The personal income tax, surprised me completely, because there were 200,000 foreigners that left the country, and yet personal income tax actually went up by 12%, GST up 23%, COEs you can see up 65%, stamp duty 126% from the property transactions. So it turned out to be a pretty bumper year even on the fiscal side, and therefore narrowing the projected deficit. So I wouldn't be too worried that the government, that the delay of the GST hike has kind of crimped the fiscal space. And I'll probably add that the projections for this year actually is extremely conservative. The government's looking at revenue increases of only 2 to 3%, which doesn't quite jive with the tax buoyancy and the high inflation environment. So I would put it at probably the final budget figures for this fiscal year will actually turn out to be a surplus. The reserves keeps on rising. The government doesn't really talk about the stock of fiscal reserves in the budget. One added plus is actually for the next net investment return is the MAS will be transferring about 140 billion to GIC to manage. So that's 137 billion US, which is a substantial amount, which will also raise the returns hopefully to reserves. But you can see that MAS had to deal with a very interesting problem, because since the pandemic started about 2 years back, reserves has just gone through the roof, suggesting that there's a lot of capital that's trying to come into Singapore, and basically the central bank has had to intervene quite heavily to actually stop the Sing dollar from appreciating. As it stands now, the Sing dollar is hovering at the upper bound. But this will again lift up the returns. So I just wanted to give this a sense of the number as well. The government reviews the net investment, the flow of the returns, the contribution, which is around 20 billion now. And as Selena highlighted, and one of the biggest items, we would have expected maybe that the stock of government assets and investments to actually fall, given that the president approved, 50 billion drawdown on the reserves, right, to fund the pandemic package. but actually it went up, right? So as of March 2021, the fiscal assets of government still went up by about 50 billion, 51 billion, and government investment assets actually still went up about 23 billion, which just shows you how strong the government's fiscal position is. And I mean, when you think about it, a 50 billion increase in it's a recession year. That's why the ratio of GDP actually shot up so dramatically. When a GST increase of 2% only raises 3.8 billion, just give a sense of the relative magnitude. The government's in a pretty strong position. Of course, some of this fiscal assets and investments includes buildings, includes the liabilities to CPF, which is our money. But still, I think stripping out, probably the government's overall assets is probably, GIC, Temasek, MES add together is probably about 900 billion, I would guess. I think Selena already talked about this. It doesn't come at a good time, but the positive is that the GST has been spread out over 2 years, and inflation will show up probably more meaningfully next year. Our estimate at a 2% GST hike raises inflation about 1.3 percentage points. So that's spread out 0.6 from 2023 and 0.6 for 2024. And the government has also agreed to cushion that impact, not just from the GST offset package, the insurance package of the 6.6 billion, but also through the freezing of licenses fees, all sorts of other charges, and also basically doubling down on the conservancy rebates as well, to offset some of the rising utility costs. And it's been extra generous because it's going to double. And actually that also feeds into the inflation numbers, and that kind of artificially or brings down some of the prices for those charges. On the BEPS impact, I think as the minister said, I think they're still trying to figure out what the ultimate impact is. I mean, I think 2-3 years ago, the concern was a lot more intense, because I think the fear was that there's going to be a big shift in the recognition of profits that will move to where the consumers are rather than to where the activities are actually taking place. And we all know that MNCs in Singapore, a lot of the operations is to market, right? It's to service the region and so on. But I think over time, there's been so many carve-outs and all that, the concern has kind of abated. I mean, the one big carve-out, of course, is following the UK's lobby is the carve-out of the financial sector, right? The financial sector is huge in Singapore, and it's probably where a lot of low concessionary tax rates are for some of the big banks here, US American big banks. So that's 13-14% sector carve-out of the agreement, and then of course commodities and all that, trading and all that is also carved out, as well as shipping is also carved out. So that picks up quite a lot of MNCs that will probably not be affected, and in no way does it threaten Singapore's standing, especially as a financial center. You can see that in terms of the investors in Singapore, US is the largest, and of course you get all this offshore vehicles in Japan and so on. So we took a look at the data actually that was provided from the US IRS, as well as the data provided to OECD. Singapore doesn't disclose the average tax rate paid by MNCs, right? By nationality and so on. So this chart is for US American MNCs. And basically when you look at the US data, we find that American MNCs are only paying an effective tax rate of 4%, which is remarkably low. That's the data, and then you can see it's a sample of 825 companies and so on. And then American MNCs pay much higher rates in some of the other countries. And for the most part, a lot of them are actually slightly higher than the 15%. So that tells me that essentially if there is going to be a top-up tax, it could be a considerable top-up, which means that the revenue increases from this this top-up to the minimum 15% could offset the risk of some of the base being eroded and shifting elsewhere. this is the data that we took and looking at the tax rates of non-American MNCs as well. So whatever's available, and you can see that just not American MNCs, but like it looks like Australian MNCs, Italian MNCs are also paying below the 15%, whereas the French and the China MNCs are paying slightly above the 15%. I mean, we all know historically that I think Singapore has always courted more the American MNCs, right? Maybe not just for economic reasons, but also for strategic geopolitical reasons, to ensure an American presence in ASEAN and in Asia. So I think, yeah, so I'm not too worried, and I don't think that the negative effect from the corporate income tax will be that big for Singapore, but let's see how it goes. The personal income tax, I think Selena has already highlighted. I think it's to be expected that as part of the social compact, there was hints and that the top bracket will probably be rising, and this is really only for the top 1.7% of the personal income taxpayers. There's probably a limit to how much you can continue raising that personal income tax bracket, because I think the spread with the corporate income tax, which is 17%, as it gets larger, there's an incentive for incorporating into companies and trying to avoid these taxes. I think Singapore is also probably doing it because of what's happening in Hong Kong. Has probably given a lot more room to cut taxes without the fear that there'll be outflow of talent and exodus, because Hong Kong is dealing with its own issues, and the flow of talent and companies seems to be going to the other way. So Hong Kong's taxes are still low, but I think it's no longer seen as much as a competitive threat as it did 10 years ago. Well, this was going to be the most natural way of taxing wealth, and that's through the property taxes, right? So I think, given that what the folks in the papers, they were asking for a GCB tax and so on, right? And it should not just be the investment properties, because even the a rich tycoon and so on should also pay their fair share, right? And a lot of cooling measures and transaction taxes was not just going to capture this, because the wealth just stays, right? It's not transacted. So this will be a natural way of raising the contribution on wealth, and this is non-movable wealth. Whereas you try to tax stuff like net wealth, clearly there could be capital flight and money moving away. Still, it's a very steep increase. I did ask the question of whether the wealth tax can also be discriminated between locals, foreigners, and permanent residents. And I think the government's reply was essentially that that's not allowed under international tax rules. There has to be by residency. So whereas you could actually discriminate in terms of the cooling measures between citizens, PRs, and stamp duties and all that, you can't really do that in terms of the property tax. Okay, the luxury tax, I think is fairly straightforward. I think as Selena highlighted, the raising of the carbon tax was quite substantial. It put Singapore pretty much in the top, almost the top quartile by 2030, and it will spur this shift towards renewables and cutting carbon emissions and so on. I guess the only kind of contradiction to me would be in terms of the carbon tax is also on the consumer side, that at the same time we are giving very generous rebates for households, right? And it's going to be doubling of that rebates, which kind of takes away an incentive, because you're going to get rebates for electricity prices and water all going up. Then the whole idea of high prices also for the consumer doesn't really work in curbing, fuel consumption and so on. But I guess it's political, and it's difficult to not provide those handouts. On the tightening, I was, I guess, a bit disappointed with this on my own view, is that the tightening has been significant enough, and that at the same time, in September we're already going to have wage pressures that's going to be coming from the introduction of this minimum salary, 1,400, which could affect about 9% of the labor force. And of course, we're going to have the expansion of the progressive wage model to the retail sector in September, and to the expansion to the F&B sector, which is huge in Singapore, probably over 100,000 people next year. And that's already going to increase wage pressures, right? As it is, wages have already been rising, rose 3.6% this year. I won't be surprised if it rises about 4% this year. And we have this tightening. So I think that's a slight worry for me. And I didn't think it was necessary because we've already had a huge exodus of workers, of non-resident workers from Singapore in the last 2 years. Right? The chart on the right-hand side kind of gives you a sense of the numbers. But basically, when you add up roughly more than 200,000 non-residents have already left the country, and they've been very slow to come back. And you can see that the labor tightness is across many countries, and you might be competing for the same pool of workers to come back to your country when some of the rules and all that are actually a lot relaxed in the US or in Europe and so on. So, so this part, I would have liked them to just defer to later years to see how things go and to see whether foreign workers and talent actually comes back, especially since so many sectors, healthcare, construction, manufacturing are all facing some kind of crunch on workers. Bear in mind that there will be also a reduction in some quotas, the DRLCs, dependency ratio ceilings, as well as hikes in the levies in the coming year. These are all the details of the levy increases and so on. Okay, I guess the job support scheme, there was a 500 million package for businesses and all that. It seems okay, but actually we just have to bear in mind that some companies have been so used to such generous handouts for the last 2 years, 28 billion of job support, which is on the wage subsidies, that suddenly it's going to be going down so dramatically. They could have some withdrawal symptoms, right? So I think some companies will have to get used to it. We have recovered quite strongly, but the recovery is a bit uneven, so there are still sectors that are struggling. But bear in mind that March this year will be the last payout of the job support scheme. So we'll see whether companies who have been sort of surviving and basically staying alive because of this wage subsidies might start feeling the pressure. So you can see that some of this, the table on the right shows the last remaining sectors that are getting some kind of wage subsidy. They've been whittled down to only 10% of the 4,006. It's already essentially over, but the last payout will come out in March this year. Healthcare spending is rising, as you can see here, and it's probably part of justification for the budget. So I'll just end with this slide. It looks to me that Singapore's economy is resilient. We don't really have to worry about the fiscal sustainability near term. I think the government's in a very strong position. They could afford the room to wait for and delay the GST hike, even without the incredible package and paid out and draw down. The stock of fiscal reserves continue to go up in a recession year. GDP growth, longer term, this year we're looking at 3.8%, but I think longer term we have to realize that with the aging population, it will probably slow to 1.5 to 2.5. And the foreign manpower policies are here to stay. Right? The government continues to expand the social safety net. There'll be broadening coverage of the progressive wage model over time. We have now the local qualifying salary. I presume that 1,400 could also be raised over time. And some of the higher taxes here are some of the ways to fund it. I think Singapore will still maintain its hub status and connectivity. It's benefiting, I think, from being the major in international financial sector now, in Asia, especially with what's happening in Hong Kong, and it will continue to benefit from supply chains moving to ASEAN. And Singapore's thinking long term. It's investing in healthcare and green infrastructure. But I think we have to be prepared that Singapore is emerging to become a very high wage and high cost society. So some kind of business, very labor intensive or the low cost or low value added does not make sense to be Singapore. And I think the budget also encourages some activities to be offshore. Okay, thank you. I'll stop here. I'm happy to take questions at the end.
Thank you very much, Hak Bin. James, over to you.
All right, thank you, Victor. Let me pull up. All right, I hope everyone can see my slides. And firstly, good morning, everyone. Yeah, thank you for having me. So Victor made the comment earlier that this year's budget had a lot of interesting tax announcements, and I had a lot more to talk about compared to my predecessors. I think that's true. I mean, from a quantitative aspect, this year's budget actually contained few measures. However, the few measures that were announced actually had, in our view, will have pretty significant impact to large segments of taxpayers in Singapore, right? And that's really in two buckets that we've identified, right? From the budget perspective, our finance minister talked about a number of key themes affecting the Singapore economy, and I wanted to focus on bucket number 3, talking about sustainability, and I'll talk a bit about the carbon tax measures. And then I want to talk about bucket number 5, which contain quite significant tax changes or upcoming tax changes to the corporate tax regime, which is the METR, personal income tax in terms of rate changes, as well as taxes on high income or wealthy individuals in the form of taxes on luxury cars and property tax. And last but not least, also it's indirect taxes, which Selena and Hak Bin have talked about as well. Right? I thought when listening through the presentations that Selena and Hak Bin made earlier, they were very interesting, and I thought it was great that they went through an overview of the tax changes, made my job a little bit easier. But what I wanted to do in my presentation was go perhaps more to the on the ground, right, and talk about the impact that we are seeing from our conversations with taxpayers, as well as the various government ministries like the Ministry of Finance and Inland Revenue Authority of Singapore. Right. So first up, I'll talk about GST, and I think the rate changes have been in the works for some time. The government has announced a slightly delayed increase to 1st of January next year, a stepped up or staggered hike, if you will, to 8% on 1st January 2023, and then to 9% on 1st January 2024. Right? I think this is absolutely necessary, as both presenters before me have talked about. We need to raise the revenue. I think one interesting observation, at least from our perspective in UI, is when we compare to the rest of Asia, the GST rate, even at 9%, is still relatively low. Right? We compare to the EU and Japan, right, where tax rates are higher, and even Australia as well. We see the VAT and GST rates going closer to 20%. Right? So this really begs the question, is there capacity to increase the rate higher? And perhaps this may be the case further down the road, right, in mid-2020s or closer to 2030. Right? We don't know at this stage, but I think it wouldn't be a surprise to us if that GST rates increase to a higher rate. Now, turning to what it really means for different parts of the economy. GST is what we call a consumption tax, right? Which really means that the tax burden is on the consumer, and a lot of talk in the press and from the government's perspective has been the impact to the consumer. Right? And that's important because we are in an environment with high inflation rates now today, right? And so the government has introduce a number of important and necessary measures to soften the impact of the GST rate increase. And I won't go into them in detail, but they are important from our perspective. But we also consider the impact on businesses, right? And that's where GST is interesting, because while the tax burden is on the consumer, the tax collector, the people with the tax compliance costs is actually on the business, right? And that's where I think there hasn't been a lot of discussion in the press, for example, regarding what it really means for the business to have a staggered rate increase. While it's important and perhaps necessary to, from a consumer perspective, the business actually will face increased compliance costs, because if you have a staggered rate increase 2 times, right, it also means that the effort and resources and time needed to take into account a rate increase will double up. Yeah? This will have impact on the invoicing systems, the accounting systems, how the tax function in the businesses and finance function complies with claiming input tax credits and all that. Right? And of course, with higher rates, tax amounts and quantity of tax collection increases, and also the tax risk of making sure the systems are all there, the governance controls are sufficient, and what happens if you get it wrong, right? There will be higher penalty amounts as well. So I think what we are seeing on the ground, and this has already happened after the GST rates were announced, many taxpayers who are in the GST system are actually looking at their internal systems and talking to GST, their GST advisors. Right? So turning to wealth measures, and I call them wealth measures because I think these are changes that have a very symbolic message in the finance minister's budget speech. Right? While arguably these measures will not lead to very significant increases in tax collection rates, I think the message is clear. If you have the means to contribute more to society and to pay for all the benefits that the government, or the necessary costs that the governments will incur, I think you are expected to contribute more. Okay. When we looked at the budget, I think first observation or initial reaction was that the government hasn't gone for a broad-based wealth tax, right? Unlike some other countries. There's been a lot of speculation that perhaps we will introduce an estate duty or inheritance tax. That wasn't the case, right? Question though, whether further down the road that will be introduced. I think right now the government has focused on asset-based taxation, especially assets that are considered immobile, right? Or inelastic, right? Compared to the demand. And the first up would be cars, right? And I'll talk about the cars and then property tax, and then I'll jump back to the personal income tax rates. Right? On cars, I think, very few car buyers, I think, will be impacted. I think if you look at the OMB, we are talking about supercars here, right? So, for example, some of the premium car brands. Now, on property taxes, sorry for jumping around. I'll go back to the personal income tax later. On property taxes, I think the rate hikes were interesting. I think obviously they were pretty significant, steep jumps in rates. What it also means is that for non-owner occupied residential property rates, there'll be really 2 forms of tax increases. I think one on the property tax front, right? If you have a residential property with a high annual value, right? We're talking about the large landed properties, for example, you will be expecting to face significant increases in annual property tax. But we also need to remember there's a linkage to personal income tax, right? Because the rent from that property will be in the property owner's income, taxable income. And that's where we go back to the personal income tax rates, where we have increases in the top 2 tiers of our progressive tax rate system, right, to 23% and 24%. And one interesting thought that we were thinking about here in EY is when it goes to 24% on the personal income tax front, there'll be a 7% rate differential, right, on between personal income tax, the top tier, and the corporate income tax at 17%. Right, we were wondering whether that would trigger behavioral changes, like those who can and have the capacity to do so, like sole proprietors or contractors or consultants, right? Would that spur corporatization behavior, right? Which would essentially mean perhaps more sole proprietors would be encouraged to corporatize and do business as a company. I think that's certainly possible, but bear in mind, I think there's rules against ensuring that you don't, or people don't do that for abusive tax purposes. There needs to be a valid business reason. But anyway, interesting things to come, and only time will tell whether behavior will change. Yeah. Now, turning to corporate tax, a lot has been said on this, and that's where we move from individuals and SMEs to large MNCs, or what we call multinational enterprises. And just yesterday, Hong Kong announced its budget for 2022, and something similar was made by the Hong Kong finance minister as well. Right, so Hong Kong will be introducing a domestic minimum top-up tax come 2024. And this follows a number of other countries that have made similar announcements, like Ireland, Switzerland, the United Arab Emirates as well. Right? And therein is Singapore's own version, which is the METR. Now, what you see on the screen here is how we think this domestic minimum tax will be designed. And one caveat, it's not confirmed. I think the government has already announced that there will be consultation, and there will be a pretty detailed analysis of how the rules will be designed. But what we think is that there will be a top-up tax of 15%, as already announced. There will be a threshold of 750 million euro. And why we need it is that we need to protect Singapore's taxing rights, because ultimately what the government has indirectly said, right, from a policy perspective, is that Singapore profits should be taxed in Singapore, and there shouldn't be a scenario where Singapore profits ends up getting taxed in another country and another government has earns the taxing revenue on that. Right? Now, when it comes to how that will impact corporate tax revenue, I think that's going to be interesting, right? Because in the short term, I think there will be an increase in corporate tax revenue. Right? Large MNEs do need time to consider the impact, and if restructuring efforts are needed, I think that generally will take. It will not happen overnight. Right? I think it will be a number of years before we actually see where the cards fall. Yeah. I do think that Singapore's outlook is pretty positive. I think for first reason is, as the other presenters have talked about, the Singapore plus points is a lot more than just tax. Right? And we see that from day-to-day conversations with MNE taxpayers in Singapore. The second reason, as I alluded to, is that other countries are introducing a top-up tax of 15% as well. So it simply levels the playing field, right? And if the tax playing field is level, then we look at other factors, right? The attractiveness of the labor force, right? The rule of law, strength of the rule of law, the efficiency of the Singapore government, where Singapore lies in the supply chain. And I think that's really going to be important in the long term. Now, in the budget speech, there was no specific mention on incentives, and I think this will be creating some level of uncertainty with foreign MNEs who enjoy incentives in Singapore. I think that's unavoidable, and what we're really confident from talking to various stakeholders taxpayers is that all this will pan out, right? I think there will be newer forms of incentives that will work, right? Because as Minister Lawrence Wong alluded to or said in his speech, right, the competition for FDI is not going away, right? Perhaps tax competition has been somewhat dull, right? But it doesn't change the fact that governments will be competing for FDI. Now, on the timeline side, it's going to be interesting because I do think any design or consultation with industry will require at least, say, about a year, right? That's going to be our estimate. So at the very earliest, I don't think 2023 is realistic, to be frank. I think at the earliest, we might be talking about 2024, which is in line with what other governments have announced, for example, Hong Kong. Now, I won't go into this in detail, probably bore everyone to death, right? But this is what is likely going to happen when we talk about a top-up. But what really are we topping up, right? I think we're going to start with accounting profits with certain adjustments, and we're going to use the taxes paid in Singapore to calculate the ETR, and any difference between that and 15% will be collected by the Singapore government. Right? I think a lot will be due, a lot of the work on the design will go towards what the adjustments are, and also whether there are compliance safe harbors. Right? How do we ensure the rules are kept simple for taxpayers who find themselves in this regime? Okay. Now, impact to taxpayers as well as IRAS, right, tax authorities. I think first of all, what we are telling the people that we talk to is that everybody will need to go back and calculate their ETR. Right? How low is it? Is it even lower than 15%? If it's not lower than 50%, is there a buffer that you can be comfortable with? Right? Then if you have tax incentives, what does that mean? Right? You have to go back to the economic agency that gave you the incentive and discuss what changes are necessary. I think what's also given is that there's going to be an increase in compliance costs. Right? With any new changes of law, there will be adjustment time. People need time to get educated. The various stakeholders in the company need to understand what it means. Right? And compliance costs will be both from a monetary resource time perspective. Yeah? And with any new law, there will be periods of uncertainty where there could be differing interpretations on what the rules mean. So we are expecting an increased phase of controversy, which means risk. Right? How do you manage that? And then internally, we are also telling our clients, please report to stakeholders. Everybody needs to know about that and what it means to the company. And last but not least, internal systems. Right? This top-up tax that the OECD and now the Singapore government has announced is reliant heavily on data. Right? And I don't think large MNCs can afford to do this manually. So a lot of effort, I think, will be in technology and in automation to ensure that the reporting process is in line with the compliance obligations. Now, in my last slide, before I hand it over to Victor, we talk about sustainability, and this is an area where our sustainability colleagues in EY has been facing a lot of interest in the last year or so. Right? And this year's budget, this is not surprising at all. When we speak to our sustainability team, right, it's only going to be a matter of time before the Singapore government increases the carbon tax. Two key points to note. The finance minister said that Singapore does not expect additional revenue. Two reasons. I think one, any increase in carbon tax collection will be plowed back in terms of incentives to incentivize businesses to reduce emissions and perhaps choose greener alternatives. Right? The second reason is that this tax is really a tax to shift behavior. So over time, there will be less and less carbon emissions tax. So I think that really explains that remark by Minister Lawrence Wong. The second key point is from a company behavior perspective, our sustainability team is expecting a lot more interest in the carbon credit trading kind of facilities, whether onshore in Singapore or offshore, right? And I think a lot of interest will be on what the government means by high quality international offsets. I think that's a question mark at this stage. It remains to be seen. Yeah. Okay, and that's the concluding slide. All in, here in EY, we thought that the budget 2022 looks ahead into the future, pretty progressive, very clear messages from our finance minister, and like someone said, Victor said earlier, very well delivered. We enjoyed the speech by Minister Lawrence Wong. Back to you, Victor. That's the end of my presentation.
Thank you so much, James. And welcome back, Hak Bin and Selena. Thank you all very much for your presentations. A lot to unpack, but maybe if I can start with you, Selena. You made an intriguing comment during your presentation on inflation. And you said that in certain aspects, Singapore is a beneficiary of all the supply chain bottlenecks. Could you just expand a little bit more on what you mean by that?
Okay, thank you, Victor. I knew that that was going to be a very controversial statement. What I'm trying to say actually is that, there's been so much news about supply chain bottlenecks basically causing problems in countries and firms, right? But from Singapore's point of view as an economist, when I look at the data, whether it's the GDP data in terms of our export data, manufacturing production, actually last year was a fantastic year. In fact, if you look at manufacturing and electronics, PMI, we have been in expansion territory for like 13, 14 months running straight. And despite a little bit of an expected slowdown in the first quarter of this year, we're still expanding, right? And if you look in terms of the foreign direct investment numbers coming in to Singapore reported by the EDB, it's another record year as well. That's what I meant by we seem to be fairly immune, or at least, potentially even benefiting from some of these supply chain problems because of where we are in the whole value chain.
Thank you. And one follow-up question just on carbon tax for... Sure, Hak Bin, sure.
So I think the MES had an interesting study on that to highlight why the supply chain seemed to have not affected Singapore's exports as much. And I think one of the points that was made was that a bigger proportion was actually in the intermediate component space, semiconductors, right? Whereas if you are a producer of cars like Japan or Thailand, well, you're missing a component and the whole thing gets disrupted and you have to close the factory for the cars for a couple of months.
Yeah.
So the fact that you're producing just the ingredients, and semiconductors, of course, is in short supply, that has probably helped Singapore's exports.
Thank you. Just a question on carbon tax for all of you. Do you think that the imposition of the carbon tax and the increases that are projected from financial year 2024 up to 2030, will that spur innovation? Because clearly that's one of the aims. The government, as you've all said, doesn't expect to get any revenue from this. It hopes to spur innovation. Do you feel from your clients and your sense, do you think that's what's going to happen? Anybody want to take that?
Well, maybe I can start. I think from the bank's point of view, definitely carbon trading now has become a very interesting proposition. Yep. So I think on the finance side, the announcement that they are going to issue X million of bonds, and starting with the inaugural green financing this year, that's one area I think definitely very interesting from the capital markets development.
I think for us here in EY, Victor, Maybe let me share one observation that we've been seeing in the last year, right? The issue of sustainability and, what should large businesses do have been going up the priority in terms of stakeholder value, right? And what I mean is that this is really now one of the top 3 priority areas on various board of director discussions, right? And I think because of that, we have been having a number of important or high-level conversations with company executives talking about what is the next strategy, what is the next step in the strategy, right? And coupled with the announcements in the budget, when the carbon tax is clearly the stick, right? What will be interesting is what's the carrot here, right? Because if you adopt the carrot and stick approach and you push the issue of sustainability higher up, I think the end result or the output is going to be, there's no choice to, unless if you want to remain competitive, I think you have to innovate. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I mean, I certainly take the point that carbon trading will get a big boost. And the fact that the tax increase is as steep as it is, hopefully will encourage the change. As Selena put it in her presentation, the writing is on the wall, and that if you don't transform, you're going to end up with more than just a few problems. Moving on to competitiveness and the tax structure, I think all of you touched on this, and I couldn't agree more that when investors decide to invest in any jurisdiction, taxation is a factor, but not the only one by any means. And you all eloquently talked about those factors. There's one thing, though, that I think, and it's a bit of an elephant in the room, but the welcome factor is also key. And that's taken a bit of a hit thanks to the pandemic. Would you agree with that comment in terms of, investors have now more choice than ever before in terms of where to go, where to invest, where to live, and so on. So would you agree with me that the welcome factor in a country is a key pull factor?
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with that. And I think the worry in Singapore's case was that there was some pretty negative media reports on that, right? That that Singapore was kind of partially shutting its doors, not least because of some of the pandemic rules and border controls, but also in terms of the difficulty in extending employment passes and so on. Having met some friends, where their EP was only extended for 1 year instead of the usual 3 years, and really not given a reason by the Ministry of Manpower. So I think over the last 2-3 years, there's been a lot of focus on trying to shore up employment for residents, trying to protect local jobs, and understandably so. But I think we've got to shift away from that with the recovery, and now given that the labor market is very tight now, I think the emphasis about opening the doors a lot more generously.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is definitely a factor that people consider, and it's something that we do have to make sure that as part of our attractiveness we address. And of course, the second part to that is you don't just need the welcome, you need the willingness of the new talent to integrate. And this is something as a society we're going to need to work harder on. Talking about society and societal and workforce mindset shifts, I mean, the finance minister mentioned this. He talked about in his speech last October about productive longevity, and that significant and considerable mindset shifts in society and the workforce would be necessary. How do you see that when you look at the future of employment and business in Singapore.
Victor, maybe I can follow up a little bit on your earlier question regarding the welcome factor.
Oh, by all means.
Yeah, it's actually my view that actually the Singapore government is very pragmatic. So a lot of, some of the actions and some of the language may suggest that, they have to be a little bit tougher on getting companies and especially some industries to shift to be more manpower lean. I think we have to distinguish between the sort of blue collar jobs and the white collar jobs. And my view is always that when it comes to EPs and the rest, the talent that they need, especially for specific industries, they will always welcome them, right? I think the creep or I've seen really is that in the past, work permits, they have been very tough, but now there is a little bit of the extension, possibly into some of the, I don't know what's the right word for it, the lower level type of white collar jobs, which certain segments of Singapore could also be competing in the same space. And I think that's probably where some of these very sensational news headlines comes out, right? So I think the sense is that it's a push, right? We have this big cycle and they have to keep moving Singaporean workforce up this value chain, right?
Yeah.
In the past, you were really concerned about the very lowly educated Singaporean workers, but now you're actually trying to build a Singaporean core, and these can be the whole gamut of, PMETs, professionals, not exactly in your top echelons of your industry leaders, but basically that bulge bracket in the center, which is why I think there's a lot of focus on how can they shift this up so that they don't have the competition coming in from the foreigners as well. So it's not an easy balance, I would say, going forward. But I think, at the end of the day, when there's growth to be made, I think they will still do the right thing and to welcome foreign talent. Yeah. On your question about mindset shifts, about productive longevity, this is something that's, we like to think about it in terms of like, okay, everyone is living longer due to medical advances, hence we should be productive for longer, right? But I think the question for a lot of people, maybe in our age vintage, as we are getting within sight of retirement, right? Then we start to think about what is the balance that we want. When we say productivity, do we still want to be working in a 9-to-5 job 5 days a week? I think the attitudes may change with your age bracket. So from an economic point of view, of course, it makes a lot of economic sense to have all segments of your population being as productive as possible. But the reality is we probably can continue to extend the retirement age from where it is today. I don't know whether I've said this at the Sicc event, but I always joke. I said when it comes to time for me and probably Harbin and to retire, I think the retirement age will be 80 years old. and I'm still thinking that that's going to be the case. Yeah. So it's just the way the economy and the society is evolving, and because of the aging population, there is no easy way out. We have to make sure that the local population continues to work hard and work longer, and you supplement with the foreign talents. Yeah, thanks.
Great comments, Selena, particularly on the welcome front, and you're absolutely right. There is no quota for EP, and there's clearly a move to attract quality in order to complement our own local talent, which only makes sense. And in terms of those workforce and societal mindset shifts, I think the greatest one is to stop seeing people defined by their age and start seeing people defined by what they bring to the table and what potential they offer based on their experience. And I think that's the key change. There's too much self-limitation by individuals, and therefore that flows into recruitment and attitudes that we see around us. And I've certainly spent the last 8 years in the chamber, on a soapbox, preaching against the evils of ageism. And that's not just from a selfish personal interest, it is a problem. And as you rightly say, with an aging demographic and very low birth rates, there is no choice. So the writing is on the wall there too. James, I want to turn to you on the sort of tax stuff, and particularly BEPS. Do you see an idea that several of our members in our annual tax measures wish list for the budget suggested was sort of investment credits that could be deducted from the tax liability? Now, do you see that as something that could happen, particularly for the small, relatively small number of businesses that have an annual turnover of 750 million euro and above? And the Ministry of Finance reckons there's about 1,800 of them in Singapore. Do you see that as something that is part of the suite of options for the government, as well as for the businesses?
Yeah, I actually do. I think this is one of the options the Singapore government will have to consider now. Whether or not it actually introduces that into law, I think will depend on modeling out the cost to the government, right? So I think the various options on the table, and let's take R&D as an example. Yeah, R&D is obviously very important to the Singapore economy, to large M&Es that constantly innovate, and a lot of R&D dollars are spent in Singapore. Right? Today, the government incentivizes those R&D activities by giving super deductions, right, up to 250%. Now that obviously lowers the tax bill, which in turn lowers the ETR, which could be counterintuitive if there's a top up, right? So I mean, I know it's a lot of technical jargon, but that's plain and simple. Now the government could obviously switch that over to, say, cash credits, but with cash credits, there's an immediate cost to the government. Yeah, it's straight cost from the government coffers. So I question whether, yes, conceptually that's an option, but secondly, how big of a credit could that be, right? Obviously, the larger the credit, the more expensive it will be for Singapore. So that's going to have to be balanced out.
Yeah, and this is the sort of thing that, as I think you said in your presentation, will take time, because if such an accommodation was considered, it would all have to be customized according to each taxpayer. So there's it sounds like an awful lot of potential extra work.
Yes, for everyone, right? And it is this BEPS measures. Let me just back up. This BEPS measures is the largest single change to international tax rules in the last 100 years. I think we can even go back to pre-World War I. Right? There hasn't been such a significant change. Everybody involved, from the tax authorities, the finance ministries, to the governments, to even us on the consulting side, we are just embracing for uncertainty and a lot more work cascading down. And because the impact to large businesses, I think, cannot be generalized. And we keep emphasizing this to people we talk to, right? Different sectors will have different needs and issues. The technology sector will be very different from life sciences to resources to the financial services kind of businesses. Right? And even just on something simple like R&D, right? Not simple, I used the wrong word, but something fundamental as R&D, right? People treat R&D different. The dollars being spent could be very different depending on the industry.
Yeah, absolutely. So customization is of a sort of very high nature, and that's costly in terms of time and negotiation. So thank you. That's very useful. Just staying on tax, I thought you very eloquently, sort of put the context, James, for GST, because even with the increase it's still modest when you compare other jurisdictions. And that suggests that there's plenty of ammunition for the finance minister and his successors to work on in future years. Do you think there is the possibility that another quiver that the finance minister may have in the future would be to lower the qualifying threshold? Because again, in Singapore, $1 million is quite high. And where you compare that to other jurisdictions, I think it's sort of 73,000 Sing dollars equivalent in Australia and about 156,000 Sing dollars equivalent in the United Kingdom. So that would suggest that there's room for further progressivity and calibration.
Yes, no, certainly. I think you raised a good point. The $1 million threshold Sing dollars in Singapore is on the relative high side. I think Japan is a lot lower. The EU jurisdictions are a lot lower as well. But the question that probably the government policy team or the tax policy people in IRAS will need to consider is the cost of compliance versus the amount of tax actually collected if they were to lower the thresholds, right? So if we lower to say $500,000, 500,000, right? I think you may capture a segment or SMEs that were not in the net before. But with those kind of revenues, I think the question has to be asked, what kind of output would that get you, right? In terms of that 8% or 9% GST that is levied on those revenues, right? And if the answer is that not much revenue is going to be collected versus putting these kind of SMEs through the pain of complying, and I say pain because it can be somewhat painful.
Yep.
Then it may not be good tax policy, and I think that's something the government is trying to balance out. Yeah, I think the likelier outcome in the future might be rate hikes. That's my personal view, and very happy to be proven wrong. I do think there is capacity for increase in rates further down the road, and of course that's always going to be somewhat. There's going to be a political cost to that. Yeah? And the finance minister said it rather interestingly. He said, well, to be frank, nobody likes talking about tax increase. Right? That's very true. And there's a political cost to that. Yeah? So his successors, or maybe himself if he stays on for the longer term, will have to deal with that, I think, in subsequent years.
Yeah. But I think sort of rounding off, because we've just run out of time, I think, Hak Bing, you made a very good point that despite everything that the pandemic has thrown at us, Singapore is still a very resilient economy. And I think you highlighted very eloquently the remarkably healthy state of Singapore's reserves. So, I mean, that's also cause for celebration. I mean, we are as a country operating from a position of strength. That does not mean that there's any room for complacency, because as Selena mentioned, the writing is on the wall that businesses do need to refocus back away from sort of survival and the job support scheme and the pandemic to how do we transform, how do we grow, how do we make ourselves more sustainable. So I want to thank each of you for your time and your expertise. I wish we had longer, because there's so much in this budget that we could talk about. But thank you very much, all of you. I hope that we can encourage some of you to come back, and maybe when more of the flesh has been put on the budget announcements in the Committee of Supply debate, maybe after the debate we can have another chat about what some more of the detail means, particularly the anticipated change to employment plus application process. But ladies and gentlemen, I just want to leave you with a few words about our SICC Awards for Collaborative Innovation. We launched these as part of our SG50 celebrations because collaborating is often the fastest way to innovate. I'd like you to mark your diaries for our TV program with the winners of last year's awards on Channel News Asia on the 31st of March at 7 p.m. And this is the learning component of our awards. And do check out www.siccawards.com.sg and participate in this year's awards. Nominations close exactly in 3 months' time on the 24th of May. So tell your friends and get involved. If we can help you in any way, drop an email to here-to-help@sicc.com.sg. If you would like to join our ecosystem with an edge, write to membership@sicc.com.sg. But from me, our expert speakers, and my team, it's goodbye, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. James, Selena, Hakbin, thank you very much again.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.